Okay, hello chess players. Today I'm going to be going over how to play the white side against a certain variation of the Sicilian. It starts after e4, c5, knight f3, knight f6. This is called the Nimzowitsch variation of the Sicilian. And this video is going to be specifically on one of the main lines of the Nimzowitsch variation, beginning with the move pawn to e5, knight to d5, knight to c3, which offers up an exchange of these knights. And I did a separate video where I covered the Nimzowitsch variation, and it focused pretty much exclusively on this knight exchange. But a lot of people in that video were a little upset that I didn't include pretty much the main line, or one of the main lines, this move pawn to e6. And I pointed out in the comments that I probably should have included it in the video, and that it probably deserved its own video, and that's what this video is going to be focused on. It's going to be focused on how we need this e6 move when they play the Nimzowitsch variation. Anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So, in the comments, I just said, really, white should just play knight takes d5, e takes d5, and then just play d4. And at this point, we should just expect that white has some sort of slight advantage. And that's absolutely true. Like, if you just do this, if you just exchange on d5 and play d4, you definitely have an advantage. One of the things is especially like on the lower levels, is you're presenting black with this immediate problem that isn't so easy for people that aren't familiar with this opening and aren't familiar with the theory to solve, which is you're threatening to double isolate these two d-pawns. So, for instance, if black were to capture right away, which is a terrible move, c takes d4, you could just play queen takes d4, and it's not clear how black defends this pawn on d5. As a matter of fact, maybe black just can't defend this pawn on d5. Maybe it's not even reasonable to try. For instance, black should maybe counterattack. Maybe he could play queen c7. If he develops a piece like knight c6, we just play queen takes d5. This is a decisive advantage white. White has the extra pawn. But let's say queen c7. Let's say they counterattack. We could, of course, just defend the pawn on d3, and again, present black with the same issue. How in the world do you defend this pawn on d5? And again, there isn't a clearly great way to do it. At some point, probably white will pick it up. But what's interesting is we could also just take it. We could play queen takes d5, because black has almost no development. So, for instance, he could play queen takes c2. The computer wants to play bishop d2 here, and after queen takes b2, the computer wants to play rook c1. Now, this is given as decisive advantage white. White's threat is obvious. He's intending rook takes c8, so knight takes c6, knight to c6 is forced, and then bishop c4 just threatening queen f7. Knight d8 seems forced, and then bishop b5, which threatens rook c8, followed by queen d7. So knight pretty much has to come back to c6, and then white should just castle, get his king out of the middle, and you can see white's down a pawn here, but this is a lot of compensation for a pawn. If I could sack pawns and get this much compensation, I would absolutely sack a pawn every single game. White has, but no doubt that white has massive compensation for the material here. White's probably got a decisive advantage already. So, for example, bishop e7, we could play bishop c3, which nearly traps the queen, but the queen still has one move, but it just kind of sets up this shot. It sets up e6, which of course sets up an attack on g7. It sets up the shot of d captures e6, bishop takes c6 check, which would be winning, and kind of leaves maybe f takes e6 as the only move, but then queen h5 check, g6, queen h6, we are threatening the rook, so the rook moves, then queen h7, we're threatening g6, and this is pretty much game over. This was a line given by the engine. So bishop d6, rook d1, bishop f4, we could take with check, rook f7, now bishop c6, bc6, bishop d2 takes, now knight e5, queen f8, rook d2, decisive advantage white. White is obviously completely winning here. Up an exchange, up a passed pawn over here, h2, h5, h4, h5, h6, etc. Just completely winning. So that's just a for instance. If cd4, of course, nobody's going to play cd4. They're going to play other moves. The main line here is knight c6. Now, one of the main lines here for white, and a line that I don't necessarily recommend because it's extremely messy, is this move d captures c5. But it is a legitimate line here for white. The computer gives it as good for white, but it leads to this incredibly complicated position where both sides get an attack. The point is, after dc5, black's going to play bishop c5. We need to take that pawn on d5, and then queen to b6. And now, of course, we can't defend f2, but they have difficulties defending f7. So bishop to c4, bishop takes f2 check, king to e2, castles, rook f1, bishop back to c5, knight to g5. So white has a huge counterattack on the f7 square, but of course black is still kicking. Black can play knight to d4 check, king to d1, knight back to e6, and now knight e4 is the best move, pawn to d6, and now after e d6, rook d8, it is really critical here that the best move is apparently bishop to d3. This wasn't always found. I found one game, Karyakin versus Mamanjarov, and of course Mamanjarov is a very strong player, but Mamanjarov continued with c3 in this position and got into some trouble after bishop d6 and eventually ended up actually losing the game. So bishop d3 is the correct move here, and white, of course, is doing a-okay here. White's got quite an attack. I'm taking this from Svidler versus Vashili, played back in 2021. That game continued bishop d6, queen h5, bishop back to c7, queen takes f7 check, which was a very strong move, king h8, bishop to d2, knight f4, bishop takes f4, bishop to g4 check, and then taking, then rook d7, hitting the queen, queen comes back, and then taking here with check. Of course, here we don't have rook takes f4 because, of course, we have the queen coming to g1. So another sidestep, king d1, queen h6, and then a4. And it turned out that white was doing pretty good here, and eventually white did go on to win. But like I said, for me anyway, just looking at these positions, looking at these complications, I don't see why I'm obligated to play d takes c5. I feel like positionally I have some sort of advantage here. Why not just maintain my slight advantage positionally and just hold my center, play c3? Actually, one of my very first wins against a master was doing something a lot like this in an Aleknitz defense. I doubled my opponent's pawns on d5 and d7, and I just held my center. And I said, okay, what are you going to do? And then, of course, fortunately, my opponent actually ended up making a tactical mistake a few moves later, and I ended up winning the game. And that's how I beat my first master, and that's another reason that I don't put a ton of study into positions like this, because I already have this familiarity from a very long time ago dealing with these pawn structures, and I've always just felt very comfortable just setting up this pawn chain and just declaring that I have some sort of slight edge. And it's a very easy position for white to play once you do that. Once you play c3 and you just hold your center, it's very difficult for black to get anything out of this. The main try is going to be something like d6, and then of course we should just play bishop to b5, because black is putting a lot of pressure on your center, but your center by no means is going to completely collapse here. So I've got a couple games here. I've got Polgar versus Sikula, played in Hungary back in 2008. That game continued with sort of the questionable move pawn to c4, and then Polgar played very principled. She castled. We have bishop e7, we have b3, cb3, ed6, queen d6, ab3, queen c7, rook e1. Now, of course, Polgar just has an advantage here. Polgar has the better pawn structure, the better center, the better pieces. Just generally, her position is classically better. And she proved that very, very well in this game. So I will show the complete game. It continued bishop e6, bishop g5, bishop d6, c4, again taking over that center. Castles, pawn to c5, bishop e7, bishop c6, bc6, pawn to b4, bishop g5, knight g5, bishop f5, queen f3, and again, just a lot of maneuvering here, just putting pressure on both the center of the board, and now, of course, creating luft, and then putting pressure on this a-pawn, all of which black found very difficult to deal with, because black is just sort of suffering, shuffling his pieces back and forth sort of aimlessly, as white just increases pressure, increases pressure. This is the advantage of having more space and having a better pawn structure. Black's weaknesses are accessible, white's weaknesses are difficult to do anything about. So we have bishop to e4, knight d2, and then just more maneuvering took place. Finally, this breakthrough with b5, taking advantage of the multiple pins. Then we have takes, and you would think, okay, if it's me playing white, I'm probably just snapping on a6 right away or something. But not with a top flight player like Polgar. She's going to do something quite a bit more nuanced and better. Queen f3, bishop g6, rook b6, again just continuing to improve, and then the queen goes back to a3, we have h6, and then taking full advantage of the now loose bishop on the g6 square, which is no longer anchored after the move h7 to h6. This very nice tactic, queen to g6, which is just a double attack. It threatens the rook and it threatens the bishop. And then we have rook takes b6 takes, which is a double attack of two floating pieces, the rook on a7 and the bishop on g6. And then here, and then we have queen takes g6, rook b6, rook a3, and black resigned. White is up a piece and is still attacking. So that was Polgar versus Sikula, played in Hungary back in 2008. So that's an example of what to do after c3, d6, bishop b5. What do we do if they take instead of the move that was played in that Polgar game, which was pawn to c4? What do we do if they instead play this more correct-looking move, c captures d4? Well, knight captures d4 is probably correct. Just keeping these pawns doubled. And then after bishop d7, we can simply play e d6, c d6, and white should have some sort of advantage here because this is an isolated pawn on d5. And it's really just that simple. Black has an isolated pawn on d5. So there's a lot of different ways to go here. The engine seems to think that knight f3 in this position is the strongest move, but I think the position is just simpler than that. I think you can just castle, and I don't think it's that much different than knight f3. And then after, say, castles, I think just rook e1. And I didn't find any games with this, but the engine does confirm that this is quite strong. And it's really just very principled chess. You just castle, put your rook on the open file, and okay, white has to have a slight advantage because this pawn on the d5 square is effectively isolated. And I think that's basically the way that you need to go about playing this with the white pieces. If they play this move, pawn to e6, I think we just need to play against the isolated pawn on d5. We need to take, and we need to play d4 to basically isolate that pawn. Again, if they're playing a move like c4 at some point, like either here or in the next couple moves, we're going to follow that Polgar game. We're going to follow the way Polgar played it. You just develop and eventually undermine that c4 pawn with b3. And, of course, if they take right away, queen takes d4 is nearly a winning attack already. And if they play sort of the traditional, knight c6, we should just play against the isolated pawn. c3, d6, bishop b5. Again, cd4, knight d4, bishop d6, takes, just castles. Slight edge white all day long. If you want to play the more theoretically nuanced and correct knight f3, it should also be slight advantage white. But anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess. I hope you can use these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.